Okay, so I've started with my pockets, so same application as before. So I'm basically going to do a line of stitching, a couple of mil from the edge, and then one around 75 mil or 8 mil in. And I've done the same as before. I've trimmed down the seam allowance on the inside so that when I sew the second line of stitching, the seam allowance is captured within that spacing there. So I'm just going to do that just now. Just sewing a couple of mil from the edge. And then when you get to the corner, you want to make sure that your needle's pointing down the way, so that then you can just lift your foot and change direction. I'm quite lucky because my machine does it for me, but you guys will just need to use the wee roller at the side of your machine. So yeah, so do the outside one first. Remove your pins. And then you're going to do, what I'm doing is lining up with the side of my foot, the side here, well obviously on the other side, but just so I can show you just the side of your foot, just so that when you're sewing that will be about the right distance if you cut away your seam allowance. So that's my pocket sewn in. I would give that a wee press just so that it looks like this one, but I'm going to move on to the types of seams that you're going to use for the rest of the garment, which is French seams. Now you're not going to do French seams down the side of your top or the first section on the trouser. That's because there's a vent going in the top and there's a pocket going in the trouser, so French seams won't really work with those bits. But for all the other seams, we're going to be doing French seams. So I will show you how to do those. So what you're going to do, instead of putting right sides together first, you're going to put the wrong sides together. So this is the right side with the pocket, so I'm going to flip that over. And I will trim away all these threads in a wee while. And then I'm going to put get the wrong side of the back piece. Now obviously with this fabric there's not really a definite right or wrong side, but what's worth checking, because it's kind of cheapy fabric that they've bought en masse, there's a wee mark on the side of this fabric, so I'm going to make sure that that's to the inside of the garment. So it might be worth just checking over your pattern pieces before you start sewing. So now that my wrong sides are together, I'm going to line my shoulder seam up. And I'm going to, because all the seam allowances are 1 all the way around, so they are quite small seam allowances, so what you're going to have to do is about a 0.4 to start with, or a 0.5. So you're going to start with that size of seam. Start a little bit in from the edge though, because if you start too near the edge it will catch and kind of not sit as flat. So start a wee bit in from the edge and then back tack to the edge and back again. You'll see if you end up doing it, you'll see what I mean by it following up. So just going to do a wee 0.5 seam. Okay, so I've just done a wee 0.5 seam there, and I would normally then press that to one side. But just for speed just now I'm not going to do that, but I would suggest anytime that you do the first seam, you then press it to one side so that it sits nice and flat. I'm going to, from there, because that's on the outside of the garment now, you're going to turn that in on itself, and basically it's kind of the same idea of what you were doing with the pocket. You're going to basically capture that seam allowance in the next fold, so that any of the frayed edges are going to be to the outside, are going to be to the inside, sorry, of this stitch here. Okay. So, see that there? And then if I flip that this way, you'll see that it's a nice clean seam and you can't see any of the seam allowance sticking out of it. So I'm going to give that a wee press as well. I'm going to do this technique for the shoulder seams for the crotch on the trouser, and for the pocket. Now the pockets might be a little bit more difficult, but I'm also going to do it for the side seam on the sleeve initially. Okay, so what I've done is I've sewn, here am I with the okays again, so yeah, I've sewn the 0.5 on the inside, and then I've turned it inside out and pressed it so that there's a nice smooth line all the way around. I'm now just going around with my second line of stitching to catch that in, and you'll notice that at the top there's the wee notches. This bit hasn't been sewn in, so I've only started to and from the notches here. On your pattern piece, after I've cut this out, I noticed that I should have added an extra seam allowance, so an extra centimetre seam allowance here. So you'll have 2 centimetres that haven't been captured within this seam, and that's so that you can insert it into the trouser when we get to that stage. So I'm just going to finish stitching this round. Again, making sure that I'm catching this seam, and again finishing before that notch, so that again you've got this bit here so that that can be opened up and attached into your trouser when we get to that stage. So yeah, that's that. So I'm going to do the same with the other pocket, and I'm going to do the French seams on the sleeve piece, the trouser crotch line, and the other shoulder seam on the top. Right, so that's me done my first line of stitching here for all the pieces except this one, because this is the only one that really has a right or a wrong side as well, apart from the top. So that's the trouser back pieces, because I've already inserted the pockets onto them. So again, what you're going to do is wrong sides together for your first line of stitching. I'm going to do that, and then I'm going to go press everything and then come back to the sewing machine for the second line of stitching. When it comes to pressing, I always do 2 lines of press. So I go to the inside where I've sewn my seam, and I'll press it one way so that that creates a nice sharp edge on one side of the seam. So I press it all one way, and then once I've done that, I flip it over, line the pieces flat. I'll do it this way so you can see. And then make sure that that seam is sitting right to the edge there, and then just give it another wee press so that the whole thing, when you go to stitch it, makes it a little bit easier. You don't have to keep you know, doing like, you know, checking at the seam. So see how that's not being quite pressed out, so that you want the seam edge to be right near the edge rather than sunken in. So go all the way around and just make sure that your seam, your stitched edge, is right at the very front. So it looks like that basically. And then that's ready to sew. So I'm going to do that for all the pieces, then do the second line of stitching, and then get back to you. So what I've done now is I have now done my second line of stitching for the French seams. Now I did notice that this fabric frays quite a lot, so what I ended up with was a few wee kind of fluffy bits sticking out of the seam which I've had to trim away. So what I would suggest is doing your first line of stitching, trimming it down to just a couple of mil before you press and do your second line of stitching, just so that you don't have to spend time cutting away all the frilly bits basically. So I'm going to move on now to the side seam. So you'll notice that down the side there is a little notch out of the fabric. Now this is an indication of where your French seam starts on your side seam. So above this notch is where the pocket's going to go into, and we're going to do a slightly different type of seam for that. But below the notch is where the French seam starts. So again, you're going to put wrong sides together first. So make sure that you can see your seam allowance on the inside. And I'm going to get my back piece and make sure, again, wrong sides together, so you should be able to see your pockets on the back piece. And I'm going to line up the top of the trouser with the notch here and pop a wee pin in. So there we go. So I'm going to do the exact same thing that I did before. It's a 1 centimetre seam allowance from here down, so I'm going to do 1 line of stitching, trim it away, press it open and do a 2nd line of stitching. I'm going to do that just now on both sides, and so that I end up with 2 French seams, and then we'll go back up to the top and discuss what we're doing with that and the side seams on your on the top. So I've done my French seams down both the outside and the inside of my trouser. Now this is what I mean by the wee fray bits that can kind of stick out the other side. So if you just want to, when you're just doing your final turn and you're pressing on the outside, just double check that there's no wee loose thread sticking out. So now we're going to move on to inserting our pockets. So as you can see, I've sewn right up to where that notch is there, but it's not lying completely flat. So what I'm going to do is go to the inside where my French seam is. So you can see that's my French seam there. And I'm just going to notch to the very top of that so that I can then get this bit to lie flat. So I'm just going to notch right to where the French seam starts. Right over to the stitching. Like that, and you can see that then allows this piece to sit wide open flat like that. Okay, so once I've done that, I'm going to now turn my trousers inside out again.